Hey everybody, welcome back. This week we're talking about feminisms, and note that that's more than one, the plural there, intersectionality and sex positivity. So let's get started. One of the first things we probably want to think about is what is feminism? And feminism is a name given to a group of social movements that were focused on advocating for women as a recognizable social group who were also deserving of equal rights. And of course, if we're going to think about a key aspect of that definition of advocating for women, we probably should think a little bit about what or who counted as being a woman. Different groups of feminists and different waves of feminism thought about women in different ways. And so that's something we'll want to pay attention to as we move through the readings for this week and in your thoughts about what feminism is. There's a few ways that feminism has been talked about. One of the most common understandings of feminism is in this wave metaphor. So you might have heard of first wave or second wave or third wave feminism. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But we can also think about feminisms in more of an identity-based way. So thinking about feminisms of color, Black feminism, Latina feminism, etc. Feminists with disability or disability feminism, and all sorts of other identity-based ways of approaching feminist practice. Of course, feminism is focused largely on the experiences of women and folks who identify as, or folks who identify as women. But men are also involved or could be involved in feminism, either as allies or sometimes called pro-feminist men, men who are supportive of of feminist causes and women deserving of rights and equity. But ideas about feminism also are about understanding masculinity and femininity, which of course those of us who participate in those things might be interested, regardless of whether we're men, women, non-binary, or identify with gender in some other way. Of course, there are also men who don't like feminism or are anti-feminist men. And sometimes those were talked about as men's rights movements, and you'll read a little bit more about that in some of the readings this week. Finally, before we get into sort of the timeline around feminisms, wanted to sort of make a note about feminism as something you do, or thinking about feminism as something you do rather than something you are. So feminism as practice and behavior rather than an identity that you just sort of claim and then don't have to do anything else with. Thinking about the different waves of feminism, which is probably a familiar or more familiar way of understanding feminism for most people. We have the first wave of feminism, and if we're thinking exclusively about the United States here, when in this timeline, the timelines are slightly different for folks in other countries and other places. First wave feminism is commonly thought of as the women's suffrage movement that was started in the late 19th century, early 20th century, so that's late 1800s, early 1900s. And this wave of feminism was really focused on women's entry into the public sphere. So at this time, women were not allowed to vote. They often did not work outside the home if they were white middle-class women. Of course, poor women and women of color almost always have worked outside the home. They were not allowed into most spaces of higher education and generally had a much more circumscribed access to public spaces and public participation. Second wave of feminism begins roughly in the mid-20th century, and this is probably what most people think of when they hear the word feminism. So a lot of this time was sort of thinking about the 1960s and up through the early 1990s, although second wave feminism as an ideology or a way of looking at the world is still very prominent and strong today. Whereas the first wave of feminism was really focused on equal access to society, second wave feminism focused a lot on removing obstacles to women's advancement in society and focusing on equal treatment and standing. So at this point, women had moved into many spaces that they had been fighting to get into, so higher education, the workplace, and other social institutions, but were not feeling like they were being treated equally and did not have the same opportunities for advancement as men did. Second wave feminism also looked a lot at gender inequality and the structures and processes that reproduced male domination in this space. During second wave feminism, and of course all throughout feminism, women of color have critiqued the mainstream sections of the movement as being predominantly focused on white women's issues and concerns. And so it's in this time period that you have a lot of writing and activism around women of color and their experiences. One instance of that is womanism, which you will learn more about in one of the videos posted on Canvas. And thinking about the ways in which mainstream feminism did or did not acknowledge or support or focus on issues that were of greater importance or of large importance to women of color in various ways. In the 1970s through the 1980s, we also have going on what was known as the feminist sex wars, and that was women feminists taking on a lot of contentious issues around sex and sexuality, ideas about pornography, sex work, BDSM, and these were often conflicts within feminist movements with feminists who had very different ideas about pornography, sex work, sadomasochism, and much of the work of many feminists was what we might term sex negative. Were not interested or thought that porn, for example, pornography, was harmful to women, and there was a lot of collaboration with groups, feminist groups, and conservative Republicans to pass legislation and other things that would curtail things like sex work, increase regulation of sex work, criminalize things like sexual violence, which, of course, prevention of sexual violence is a good thing, but rules and regulations that then also ended up curtailing women's ability to participate consensually in things like pornography, sex work, and BDSM. Thinking about the third wave of feminism, that starts in roughly the early 1990s and is focused much more on the structures of sex, gender, and sexuality more broadly, and deconstructing binary conceptions of those identities rather than just focusing on women. There was an increased understanding of gender and sexual fluidity and a growing importance of that in the feminist critique. In the 90s, we also see largely a reclamation of a sex-positive framework, and understanding that women have the ability to make decisions, to participate or decide whether or not they feel comfortable with pornography, sex work, and things like that. In the 90s, we also see larger attempts to broaden the movement and include more women, particularly trans women, and folks who maybe were not assigned female at birth, but still identified and moved through the world with experiences as women. And in the 90s, of course, we also see the emergence of things like the internet as a mass media, and engagement with media and the internet is also something that characterizes third wave feminism as well. And then there's some sort of questions about whether there is a fourth wave or whether we have gotten to a point of being post-feminism. These concerns were often much more highly debated right after the turn of the millennium, so in the early 2000s. But certainly we are hearing and still hear potentially this idea that we no longer need feminism because women are equal, because they can access positions of power. And so maybe we don't need feminism anymore. Post-feminism or fourth wave feminism often focuses on feminine heterosexuality as a source of empowerment, this sort of like, I'm beautiful and therefore I am powerful, and critiques of this wave of feminism have been that it has sort of been very individualized and so emptied of its wider political collective motivations, but also that this is the feminism that has been taken up by corporations and sold back to us as consumerism. So thinking about things like Nike commercials featuring strong female athletes, talking about how you can just do it, especially if you buy Nike products. Another key concept for us this week is going to be sex positivity. And in its most basic form, sex positivity is a belief that consensual sex in all its forms and iterations can be beneficial and enriching to people. This includes promoting sexual pleasure as a good and not centering all of our conversations on sex and sexuality and negativity or concern about disease or other harmful things, implying that sex is something that is dangerous, shameful, or dirty. But of course, when we are thinking about sex positivity, we also want to be very critical in how we do that. So sex positivity does not mean that everybody should be having sex all the time or everybody should be 100% comfortable with talking about sex with perfect strangers. A critical sex positivity understands that we don't make our decisions in a vacuum, that we are social beings, and that we are able to make our own decisions, but we are also influenced in ways that maybe we don't always understand by things like advertising and the social structures that we have grown up in. Critical sex positivity also questions the idea that if you are empowered as an individual and you feel empowered, whether that also means that everyone feels empowered. So again, thinking about are we centering the most privileged, perhaps white, straight, middle-class women as a determination as to whether someone is empowered, or are we looking at whether or not we need to be continuing to work collectively for liberation? Critical sex positivity also pushes back against the idea of just having a new status quo, that people should be comfortable and open about all of their sex and sexuality as opposed to feeling shameful about it. So as we know, sexuality is complex and meaning is socially constructed and is determined or influenced by where you are both in space and time. And so there aren't really any clear-cut 100% definitions about what behaviors or perspectives are sex positive and or empowering, but there are some things that we can move towards or think about, and you'll discover some of those in the readings for this week. So feminism is a way of looking through the world in addition to a set of behaviors or ideologies. So it's also a way of critiquing or understanding what is going on in society. And largely that critique is focused on thinking about gender equity or equality and what does or does not work towards that, both in terms of interpersonal interactions, but also how structures and institutions are set up, and also critiques and wants to pull apart and understand how structures of male domination and privilege come to be, how they perpetuate themselves, and how they change in order to maintain the status quo. And so some of the things that might come up are questions of, is this something that is empowering for women, or is it a form of objectification? So does this open up space for women to move through the world more equitably, or is it reducing women to mere objects? And this question will come up again when we talk about sexuality and the media and culture. It's not always easy to tell, and again, because different things might be empowering or objectifying to certain people's understandings, that those might also work in the same space as well. Something might be both empowering and objectifying. And so the last two things we were going to talk about today, the next two slides, are we might think of as specific forms of feminist critique. Intersectionality, and then we'll also talk about controlling images. So intersectionality is a concept that was first described by Black feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in a 1989 paper that she published. And in this, she argued that Black women are impacted by both sexism and racism simultaneously, and that the experiences of Black women is not of sexism is not the same as white women's experience of sexism, and that Black women's experiences of racism are not the same as Black men's experiences of racism. And what was very important to her is, as a legal scholar, she was looking at sex discrimination cases that had been argued in the courts and the way that Black women's experiences were not adequately represented in those spaces and in those rulings. And one of the things she argued is that the way that Black women experience sexism and racism in the world is not simply an additive. It's not simply sexism plus racism, although sometimes that is what it could look like, but that often these issues and experiences of sexism and racism combine into a unique experience or a unique form of discrimination experienced only by Black women by virtue of them being Black women. And so what Crenshaw argued is that we sit at the intersections of our various identities and therefore impacted differently by social inequality because of these things. And so there's another video posted on campus that goes more into depth on intersectionality and Crenshaw's work. And so you'll be looking at that this week as well. But knowing that an intersectional critique is one that wants to understand the ways in which not just the most privileged aspects of different groups, so not just white women, but all women, can be greater incorporated into our understanding and our work towards equity and equality in the world. And the last thing we're going to talk about today are controlling images, which is another form of feminist critique or another tool to use in looking at the world, at the social world. And controlling images is a concept that were first described by Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins. And she talks about controlling images as a limited number of images or representations that are repeated continuously over and over again in media and culture about a particular group. And so these are similar to stereotypes, but not the same. And so a stereotype is something that we draw on in our implicit biases about how a person's race, gender, class, or sexual orientation influences that person's behavior or how we react to that person. A controlling image goes a step further in that it is a stereotype that has become so ingrained, not just on an individual level, but on a representational level, that it becomes a means to control those who are the object of that stereotype and justifies the belief that stereotyping is acceptable. So when we think about controlling images of Black women, which is what Patricia Hill Collins was initially talking about. We think about images of the mammy, the Jezebel or the wild woman, the angry Black woman, the welfare queen, and that these are stereotypes, but they're also images that are so prominent in our understanding, but they are also limited in terms of the number of images or types of representations we see about Black women. And so it becomes very difficult for us to even see real live Black women unless they are participating in this stereotype, or we go through to great lengths to categorize real live Black women who are much more complex than any of these images into these buckets that we have seen, these controlling images. Controlling images don't only exist for Black women. We can think about Chong-Soo Khan's article in our readings for this week about gay Asian men as another sort of group that is subject to controlling images, as well as other intersections of race and gender and sexuality. And so one of the things about controlling images is that there is always an opportunity for resistance. And so thinking about, as you're reading, how do you see Black women or others resisting these images or challenging them, and how successful or effective that resistance might be, and how we can use the concept of controlling images coupled with intersectionality to really think about the effects or consequences of the work that we're doing or the way that we're viewing the world.